Welcome to Go Get Great, the podcast for aspiring entrepreneurs and ambitious small business owners. I'm your host, Brittany, owner of Brittany Miller Socials and mother of 3. Go Get Great is all about helping you make life and business work together. You'll learn about the fumbles that helped get me and my guests to where we are today so you don't have to make them. So come join the journey with Go Get Great. Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Go Get Great podcast. This is a special episode for me. We are going to be talking about celebrating 1 year of the Go Get Great podcast today. I'm so excited. It feels like a really big milestone to be able to say, hey, I've been podcasting for a year now. This is and I know some people have been podcasting for decades, but I never really envisioned myself as a podcaster for a long time. I've always been more of the written word kind of person. So I'm really excited to be celebrating 1 year and kind of all of the things that go along with it. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I have learned today over a year in podcasting. And just, that's what we're going to talk about. So I guess this is something that I have learned, but it's not actually really related to podcasting, if that makes any sense. So, like I said, I was more of a written person. So I'm just really proud of myself for kind of stepping into this role as podcast host. It was a very new title for me and kind of one of those spontaneous decisions that I made. So if you're a relatively new listener, I know I talked about this, I think, in episode 14. I'll link it in the show notes if you want to go back and listen to it. I kind of started podcasting on a bit of a whim. It was something that I was thinking about doing, and I didn't really think that I had the skill set for it. So I just, kind of kept putting it off. I was no, I'll just keep writing. I don't need to podcast, no big deal. And then I had a conversation with a friend at McDonald's while we were chatting while our kids were playing. And I was you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to try it. And if I don't like it, I'll just give it up. So I had mentally was I'm going to do it for 6 months and then we'll see what happens. And in those 6 months, I absolutely loved it. So obviously I have continued going since we are celebrating 1 year. But it was just it's really cool to kind of see how it's all come together, how much I've learned about podcasting, how much I've grown as an individual and a podcast host. Hopefully you guys will agree if you go back and listen to some of my first episodes, talking randomly. My first one was basically interview style, which is fine for a podcast. It just wasn't what I wanted, but I was so nervous. I was these are the questions that I prepared. This is what I'm okay to talk about. And then that's literally what it was. And now my conversations are more conversational style. So I really try and add my own kind of thoughts and opinions on things, which I don't think I necessarily did in the first few because I was so nervous. So that's kind of one of the biggest things for me personally, just how much growth I've seen in myself since I started doing this. But I have learned some actual things that will help you. So let's talk about that. So the first thing, it's really not hard to get a podcast set up. Excuse me. Still sick, guys. It's not hard to get a podcast set up. The actual setup piece of it is relatively quick. You could do a podcast setup from I don't know if I'm going to podcast to I've published my first episode in a week or less. Really, if you have the time and you're committed to focusing and getting it done, you can do it. There's really not a whole heck of a lot involved that way, which was my biggest hurdle and hiccup and mental roadblock that I had to overcome. I thought this was this huge, ginormous task that I was undertaking. And it is, but not the setup. The setup is relatively quick and easy. Basically just pick a name and where you're going to put your episodes, and then you just kind of start recording. So there's not really a lot in the way of that. You guys can go back and listen to episode 14 of the podcast. I'll link it in the show notes. If you want some more details about getting started with podcasting, that's the one where Grayson and I kind of talk about it. We're also working on putting a free resource together that's going to be a podcasting setup checklist. So if that's something you're interested in, just for now, send me a DM and let me know that you want it, because it's not 100% ready yet. I've got to finish putting it together, but it's coming soon. So who knows? Maybe if I have some free time before this episode actually goes live, I'll try and finish it so that I can link it in the show notes. But for the time being, just send me a message on Instagram and be like, hey, Brittany, can I have the podcasting checklist, please? And then I will send that over to you. So getting started and set up with podcasting, not hard, but the consistency and the time required to continue podcasting, that was a lot more than I thought. Like a lot more. It's kind of like having your own separate business. So it's like running two businesses that, I mean, are intertwined and interconnected, but it's like separate social media content. And not everyone needs to necessarily do that, but at the same time, you kind of do, because something else that I'll talk about later is actually getting people to listen to your podcast. And if you're not creating social media content about your episodes, no one knows you have a podcast. So you kind of got to spend the time doing that. So like all of the social media content creation that goes with it, the brainstorming of podcasting ideas, the actual time to record. I tend to be very long-winded in my episodes, and they are on the lengthier side. Like some people podcast and their episodes are on average 10 to 20 minutes. Okay, well, you've only invested 10 to 20 minutes into recording the episode. A lot of mine, especially when I'm on with a guest and we're having a really good conversation, can be like 45 minutes to an hour, which I realize is very long. So for those of you that actually listen to full episodes start to finish that are an hour long, kudos to you. Just like, thank you for doing that. I appreciate that someone is appreciating the time that I put into this and hopefully learning a lot throughout those conversations. But, on average, I spend an hour a week just recording the episodes, plus all of the prep time that goes into it, like I said, about the actual figuring out what it is that I'm going to talk about and writing out some notes that I follow, because if not, that's when we do the la 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 off-topic conversations. So I try and follow an outline for my episodes. And then afterwards you have all of like the post-production. So I don't even do all that. You guys know that. I talk about the fact that Grayson supports my podcast in that capacity. I put it in the Google Drive and he just like tells me when it's done. And he does a lot of, like, he does all of the editing for it, which is nice. Anytime I'm like, stuttering, he'll cut some of those out. Like I keep some of them in so it still sounds conversational style, but there'll be times where it'll be like, what was I saying? And there'll be like a minute and a half long pause while I regain my thoughts. Well, he cuts all of those out for me. Or if we have any tech issues while we're on with a guest, then he'll cut like the before and afters. So he has to listen to the full hour-long episode and stop every so often to like do the edits. So there's time that goes into all of that. He also honestly does the bulk of the post work, in the sense of like he sends me a notification. He's like, okay, well, here are, 3 or 4 different quotes that you can choose from. He pulls out the social media clips that I use for my podcast, and he does the 3 takeaways for me, and he does the time codes for all of the episodes. So like it takes him a long time. For me to record an hour-long episode, it probably takes him 2 to 3 hours post-production. Maybe not 3, maybe 2. But like 2 hours post-production to actually listen to everything, go through and edit it, put all that together for me, and then send it back. So, I mean, we're at like probably 3.5 hours right there. And then we still have to create the social media content that goes with it and the emails that I send. And like in general, you have like admin tasks that go along with podcasting too. So I have to find guests and I have to email them to schedule. And I'm so bad at this because I always forget until like the day of, like today. And I would try and send emails out in advance to the guests to let them know some of the questions that I'm going to ask and just like some general info about like what my podcasting style is in case they haven't actually listened to any of my episodes yet. I always forget to send those. So then you have like admin time each week too. So when I started podcasting, I thought the hardest part was going to be the hardest and most time consuming was going to be getting everything set up. But truthfully, it's the ongoing management of it. Like if I didn't have Grayson's help, I would spend on average, 3 to 5 hours a week, guys, just working on my podcast, which is crazy because there are a lot of business owners that, don't have 5 hours to work on their business in total. And this is just a podcast. This is not generating revenue for my business yet. I am confident that one day it will get there, but we're not there yet. So that was one of the biggest things that I've learned. And I don't want to scare you away from podcasting because it can be really helpful and it doesn't have to be like that. Like I said, if you're recording shorter episodes and they're like 20 minutes long, obviously that's going to cut down a very large amount of my 5 hours a week because my podcast episodes are just longer. And you don't have to be like as fancy and as picky as I do, but since we offer podcasting as a service, I'm pretty particular about, Grayson rather, because I don't usually listen to the episodes. I record it once and then I never hear it again unless I'm like watching the clips to see what Grayson pulled for me, which ones I want to use for social media. But like we're pretty picky about like the audio quality and things like that because it obviously reflects on us. Like that is our reputation. Like when someone's like, oh, well, can we see your podcasting portfolio? We're like, yeah, absolutely. And Grayson has worked with some other podcasting clients before. The Solstice twins, he's worked with them for a while. He's helped Christina Schmidt with the Building Blocks podcast. And we've actually done some work for another podcast too that hasn't officially launched yet. So, actually, and there were a couple others as well, but those were some of the more recent projects that we've done. But it obviously is like, oh, well, okay, here is our podcast. And I say our because he does most of the work, the behind the scenes work still, but most of the work, here's our podcast. This is kind of like our portfolio. This is, when you work with us, this is what we're going to try and help you strive towards. And obviously there's some limitations in that. Like obviously we're not in your house helping you record your audio quality, but we do give you suggestions and all those things. But we try and make sure that our podcast at least is as good as it can be. So it does take us more time for some of those things. And as a social media manager myself, I really try and be on top of my own social media content. So it is very time consuming in that way. Like I said, you don't necessarily have to spend that much time doing it, but I feel like that's one of the biggest things. And I think that I am far from the only person that had the perception of, oh, the setup is the hardest part and then it'll just be kind of a cakewalk to keep up with it. I think that's why there's so many podcasts out there that were great podcasts, but that people didn't keep up with simply just because they didn't have the time. Most people that podcast, some of them are like me and they're full-time business owners, and other people just do it because they love it. And like they have video game podcasts, and some of them are aggressive and they post like multiple episodes a week. Some of them aren't, you only post once a month. So that's another way that you can kind of spread out the workload of it too. But there are a lot of podcasts that I start listening to, and then all of a sudden there's just like no new episodes anymore. And I think the time piece required is the biggest thing for that, especially if you can't have support like I do, having Grayson help. Obviously, I know if he wasn't my partner, I'd have to pay him, and I would not have the budget for that. So that's kind of the big thing. So another thing that I've learned, and I've talked about this before, but finding guests for your podcast, actually super easy. It's usually just a case of sending a message to someone going, hey, do you want to be on my podcast? And they're like, yeah, let's do it. Because it's mutually beneficial. It helps you create content for your podcast, but it also helps them promote their business because they get to come on and talk about whatever it is that they're interested in or an expert at. And then usually, at least for me, I let them pitch kind of their services at the end. How can someone work with you? Do you have any free resources that someone can download if they're interested in more information? So it's a great way to position yourself as an expert. And a lot of people will do like podcasts and vlog interviews and all those things when they're like priming for a launch phase and be like, oh, I have this new XYZ product, course, service, whatever coming out. Here's some more information about it. So it's really easy to find guests, and there's a lot of different ways that you can go and do that too. Like you can just pop into Facebook groups, be like, hey, I'm looking for a guest that has, I'm looking for a guest that has, expertise in this area, is that anyone in this group? Would you be interested in being on my podcast? That works. There are like paid platforms you can set up too to help you find guests for your podcast. I've never needed to do that. I don't know if it's just because I have quite a large network of my own, but like I've got a list of people that I want to have on my podcast still. I said when I got started that one of the things I wanted to do is have my clients on to do an episode, because my clients are obviously supporting my business. I want to help support theirs too. And a couple of them I have, but for the most part, it just feels like there's always something to talk about, or they're too busy, honestly, to come on. But that is something that I'd like to start doing more of soon. And, ironically, this isn't why I podcast, but oftentimes I will have someone on my podcast and then we keep talking and then they hire me down the road for something else later. So I guess I shouldn't say that my podcast doesn't generate money, because I guess it does in that capacity, but it's not passive revenue generation. We'll say that. It's not like I talk about a product and then magically after I post the episode, it sells in my store, mainly because I just set my store up like a month ago and I haven't told anybody about it. But like down the road, those are things that I want to do. And that was why I know it's like, okay, well, the sooner I get started, the sooner I'm going to build the consistency, the sooner I'll have the audience for those things. That'll be great. And my podcast, I'm hoping, is one of the things that I'll keep up when I go on maternity leave in May. I'm going to keep putting that in air quotes because I suck at taking maternity leave. I'm hoping to continue my podcast over the summer, but who knows, I might end up taking a break. But so getting guests is easy. Excuse me. Yeah, so getting guests is easy. Kind of the flip side of that though is if you have a goal of generating income for your business, which like I said, most businesses start podcasting kind of with that intention. They either want to sell ad space on their podcast or they want to use it to promote their products and services. So, every once in a while we'll do an episode about podcasting to be like, hey, did you know we offer podcasting services? You can hire us to set up your podcast or manage it ongoingly. There's my little sales pitch for this episode. If you only ever have guests on your podcast, it's a lot harder to do those things and work your own services into an episode that's really about somebody else. So that's kind of one of the things that I had like an epiphany about somewhat recently, which is why you'll notice, like when I first started last year, my podcast format or cadence, whatever you want to call it, was 3 guests and then a solo episode, because I was like, what in the world am I going to talk about on a podcast all the time that people are going to want to listen to? So I felt like I needed guests to come on just so that I would be able to continue podcasting. But then as I've got more comfortable, I've really learned that you can, and I think I'll probably mention this later, but like you can really niche your podcast episodes. I don't know whether that sounds funny to say out loud, but you can talk for a shorter period of time about one specific topic instead of covering 7 topics in a podcast episode. So that helps you kind of spread the topics out. And, I've actually got quite a long list of things that I could talk about that at some point I brainstormed. Some of them I feel more compelled to talk about than others. I very much like to have conversations about things that are happening and relevant in my business. So the list of things that I brainstorm tends to get longer and longer and not shorter, because I was like, yeah, I should have recorded that a couple weeks ago. I'm not really feeling that. I want to talk about this today. So like this one, yes, I should have theoretically known that my podcast was turning a year. And for some reason I didn't until I got an email and it's like, congratulations, it's been a year of Go Get Great. And that was my hosting platform that emailed me to let me know that. And I was like, oh, yeah, it has been a year, hasn't it? It was like, I have no recollection of when I actually published my first couple episodes last year. So I didn't really recall that. I hadn't really wrote it down. So I was like, oh, maybe that's a good topic for today's podcast. So here we are. I'm very much like a wing it kind of person, but I know that there needs to be more strategy to, and like I do have some strategy, which I'll share in a second, but I need to be a little bit more forward thinking with planning my episodes because I really should do a better job of aligning them to like the launch phases in my business. So, like before my email marketing course comes out, I've been thinking about it. I haven't decided what specifically I'm going to talk about, but I want to do a couple episodes about email marketing so that, it promotes my email marketing course and I can be like, oh, and if you thought this was really helpful and you want to get started with email marketing, well, here is a very hopefully friendly priced course that you can do that's going to talk about all the things we just talked about and then a bazillion other things. So I want to get more strategic about some of those things, but I tend to also be a little bit of a fly by the seat of my pants kind of business person. And my email marketing course has had 3 different launch dates in the last 7 days. So we'll see. Okay, so really quick, my current podcasting strategy is to alternate. So I do a solo episode with me and then an episode with a guest. And the topics that I talk about, I try and relate to something that generates money for me. So every week it's not the same. I'm not always talking about social media. I would get very bored of that. But it's either something related to social media, email marketing, podcasting, or just like general business tips. So like my last solo episode was like a live launch debrief. So I was sharing behind the scenes of like my course. So I like to do things like that sometimes too because I like to share general business tips, not just marketing. Like it's not really just a marketing podcast. It's like in general, run a small business podcast. I should probably change my intro and outro. That's actually something that's been on my to-do list. Okay, so another thing, marketing and growth is slow. I kind of thought that I was going to have more of an uptick in how many people listen to my podcast. And I mean, truthfully, maybe I did, and I just don't know. I don't find that Apple really tracks my analytics very well. And I think that there's at least a 2-month gap where I just have no numbers for anything that was recent. And I kind of came to that determination because I had paid for some ads, some Facebook ads to promote my podcast, to grow my podcasting audience before my last course launch. And then partway through, you guys probably remember me talking about switching how people listen on my podcast on my website. It used to just be an embedded like audio player. And then I decided that I wanted to, down the road, really focus on SEO for my business, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And then I decided to create blog posts for each episode so that I could do more like SEO descriptions and things like that. And when I switched it, I had to delete the audio player off my website and start embedding players into the podcast episodes. Actually, super easy to do. I thought it would be like a tech nightmare, but it wasn't. But I was using the Apple embed code, and then all of a sudden, it's like people stopped listening to my podcast when I made the change. And I was like, okay, well, that obviously is not accurate. So a couple weeks ago, I switched it back to an embedded Spotify player instead of Apple. And I've noticed that my metrics are coming back slowly. But I was like, I really don't know how many people listen to my podcast that I can't see now. So it's never going to be 100% perfect, which as someone who's not a numbers person but cares about the numbers, like I have goals about how many people I want listening to my podcast at different times of the year. It's very frustrating that I'll never truly know how many plays per episode I get because there's just this gap in my analytics. So just be cognizant of things like that if that's something that you really want to pay attention to, if growing your podcast is really important. Obviously, if you're willing to pay to play, like I did for the Facebook ads, that can help. I need to refresh my Facebook ad content for my podcast. And then you can obviously do organic stuff. I notice that there's always a distinct uptick in podcast listens after I send an email out to my email list too about my episodes. And certain episodes, certain topics do better than others, but those are all things that you can do to kind of help grow your audience, but it is slow. And again, giant gap, but like for reference, I would say like I average maybe 10 people listening per episode outside of like the paid ads. So, I mean, don't expect like magic numbers unless you have like a magically large circle to begin with. Like Grayson's done podcasting for other clients, like I mentioned before, and their like listens blow mine out of the water. And I'm just like, how? Not that they don't have good content on their podcast, but like they started out of the gate with just like way more people listening to it than I do or than I did. So I mean, it does vary, but like don't expect a lot. Like a small percentage of your existing audience. Like if you have 1,000 Facebook or 1,000 Instagram followers, probably like maybe 5% of them will listen to your podcast. And that's kind of how you should set your benchmarks or your goals for listens when you're first getting started. Podcasting does help your SEO. It's another thing that I have since learned. However, you need to make sure you're doing it as a blog, which is probably a topic that I'll do another episode on later about how to actually use your podcast for SEO. I talked about it a little bit in a recent episode that I did with Kara. So I will link that in the show notes as well. We talk about SEO for podcasting. And like Pinterest can help with some of this stuff as well, but you have to be committed to actually like doing the blog posts for the episodes, which I don't have time for, and I don't have the budget to hire someone else to do right now. So I'm just kind of setting myself up for that success in the future, and I'll get to it later. Maybe it's something I'll come back to when I'm on maternity leave or something, when I have some more time to like actually sit down and write and like learn about SEO. SEO and I are still a little bit like, I don't know. So we'll see. But just like don't magically expect because you put a podcast on your website that you're going to have all of this extra website traffic. It's like, it's not a case of just copying and pasting the show notes. Probably not going to get you very far. I haven't really seen that work very well for me. But the more you can put up, and each podcast episode will have its own URL if you're doing it as a blog, you will eventually build credibility with Google because your website is just so diverse now in terms of the number of like unique URLs that you have. So, I mean, it will help a little bit that way, but it's not like an overnight fix. For the record, there are no overnight fixes for anything in business, but podcasting is definitely really helpful. So to summarize, because I think I've been rambling, not hard to set up a podcast, but it does take time. You need to be committed to it if you want to do it consistently. Guests are usually pretty easy to find, but if your goal is sales for your business, you need to make sure that you're also balancing out having solo episodes where people get to know you and you have the opportunity to add value and talk about your services. Marketing and growth will likely be slow for your podcast. It will be time consuming. It will feel so frustrating sometimes, but eventually it will work. Just make sure that you're looking at the right numbers for your podcast. Probably another topic that I should cover, what numbers actually matter in podcasting and what they are. And then make sure that you have a reliable tracking system for those numbers. So I find Spotify for podcasters to be pretty good. Apple I didn't find as reliable. I should probably reach out to the tech support team and ask about that. But just make sure that you're not stressing yourself out over numbers that aren't actually tracking, even though you're getting the traffic to your podcast. And podcasting will eventually help your SEO, but the more you work in the realm of blogging and SEOing, the better your results will be. Same goes with Pinterest. And then if you want to like fast track, I'm going to put that in air quotes, your success, you can run paid ads to your podcast. That does help too. I'm still learning a lot about that. Still trial and erroring it. So I'll come back to that at a future episode. But those are some of the key takeaways that I've learned from 1 year in podcasting. And I am super excited to continue with my podcast. If you're listening and you would like to be a guest, I will link the guest application in the episode show notes. I would love to have you on. And then in the meantime, just, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you again next week on the Go Get Great podcast. And it'll just be a surprise what we talk about because I haven't planned that far ahead. So have a great week, guys. We will see you back here soon.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Go Get Great. I hope you found some useful tips and tricks that can help you make life and business work together. If what I said resonates with you, please share it on social media and don't forget to tag at Brittany Miller's socials so that I can celebrate you for taking those first steps towards achieving greatness. Remember, success doesn't happen overnight. It takes dedication, hard work, and a lot of spirit. So don't be afraid to dream big and go after what you want. Keep striving for greatness. You get closer with every step forward, no matter how small they may seem. Until next time, go get great.